Hello and welcome to the Royal Statistical Society 2020 workshop, our conference. This is the Ethics and Bias in Data Science session, organized by the Women in Data Science and Statistics League. And I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker, Sophie Carr, who's the Managing Director and Principal Consultant for Bayes Consulting, and who was last year in 2019 named the world's most interesting mathematician. And she tells me that because of coronavirus, there was no competition this year. So she's still the reigning most interesting mathematician. And I am delighted to introduce her. Sophie, over to you.
So I'd like to say hello and thanks ever so much for the invite. I was really quite surprised to actually be asked to be able to come and talk to you today. And I actually became a statistician quite late on in life. I actually trained as an engineer to begin with. So as you train as an engineer, you get used to talking about tolerances and fits and how things work. And so I actually trained right from the beginning and the get-go to be used to talking about uncertainty. It wasn't necessarily the word that actually was used, but it was uncertainty. So when I slowly moved over towards statistics after I did a PhD and then started working in statistics, I was already really comfortable with uncertainty. And I've started to realise over the years that not everybody, and certainly not some of the customers that we work with, are as happy about talking on uncertainty. And I think if we want to get better at talking about ethics and bias, we need to become really open about uncertainty and really comfortable about talking about uncertainty. So there's topics like that I'm going to talk about in the next few minutes. And really, it's more about talking about questions and just getting people to think and giving you my viewpoint on how I think we can all get a bit better at being comfortable with being uncomfortable. And I suppose the starting point for me is really, why do we bother with talking about secondary data sets? Because that is where the focus of this talk was asked to be put. It was really about how, when we start to use data that we haven't necessarily collected ourselves, how do we start to talk about bias and how do we start to talk about uncertainty in a way that people understand? Secondary data sets are absolutely brilliant, and they give a richness to our data that we might not otherwise get, and it gives us an opportunity to explore ideas and opportunities to talk about data that might not be there if we only relied on our primary data set. It immediately lets us incorporate information from other studies and projects, and that stops a duplication of effort. Now, in the short term, that saves you time and money. And I'm going to keep coming back to the topic of time as we go through this. So it might, in the short term, save you time and money. But it also lets you look across time periods. So you can incorporate additional data sets into your longitudinal studies, into your time series studies. There is an incredible breadth of qualitative and quantitative secondary data that is available to us. Especially online. If you go looking at government websites, you can start finding Office of National Statistics information on there. There are surveys, there's sensor data, and public forums and online sources. One of the issues that actually comes with using secondary data sources is that for many, it's basically like being on a roller coaster ride. So what some people see as an absolute thrill completely terrifies others and takes them so far out of their comfort zone, they are not sure what to do. Finding and working with secondary data sets before we even start talking about bias and ethics and uncertainty takes you from the high of finding a data set that you think, absolutely, I can use this one, this is brilliant, down to the lows when you realise that it might not actually be applicable. And there will be the inevitable swoops and soars and highs and lows and the tipping the upside down, I don't know where to go right now. And all of the emotions that will come with secondary data sources that actually really, when you talk about it, apply to primary data sources. Now, there are some real advantages to using secondary data sets. I mentioned before that they can save you time and they can save you effort. But in my head, one of the huge advantages of using secondary data sets is that it provides massive training and learning opportunities. Before we use any secondary data source at all, the first thing we've all got to do is have a think about how we can be open and transparent about where the data comes from. We need to look long and hard about how that data fits in with our own data sets. How does it differ from any other secondary data sets that we've got? How does it fit in the overall body of knowledge within this work? Does it fit within the overall body of knowledge? Or is there something that makes you sit up and go, that's different? Why am I unsure about this? Why am I uncertain about this? What is it that makes me question why this doesn't sit within the collective body? Now, asking those types of questions, it's part of our statistical training, it's part of our mathematical training, and for me, it really was part of my engineering training. And asking those and developing the skills to answer those questions helps us, develop new insights from what was somebody else's primary data set, but it also makes us stay on the top of our game for our own mathematical skills. Now, I am really, really aware that what I see as an advantage, others might see as a big disadvantage. And this is where the time element becomes really important. We are all acutely aware of the time and effort involved in collecting primary data. Secondary data sets, they're already there. It might be quicker, there might be less time to actually get the CSV or the Access database or whatever it is in your hand, but it's not time-free at all. There is a huge time cost associated with secondary data if you are going to get down to that nitty-gritty of understanding if there is a bias in that data set and can you use that data set. There is a lot of time that has to be invested in understanding what that data set looks like. To understand, is it out of date? Is it irrelevant? Are there errors in there? What's the quality like? What's the completeness like? And crucially, has it got some form of bias in there? And when you've started to answer those questions, which aren't quick questions to necessarily answer, can you then actually use this data? So when we talk about some of the big challenges that we have with actually using secondary data sets, I think the main challenge for me is that you haven't collected the data yourself. So it might not align with the overall aim of your project. It might have been collected for a completely different reason. It might also have been cleansed or cut or prepared or had something done to it, summarised, before you get to see it. Now, all of those challenges actually become acutely focused when we're working under time pressures, because what we're trying to balance off in our busy working lives is the reliability and the validity of the secondary data set we have when combining it with the data that we want to use it with. And actually tackling those problems head on really, to me, comes down to two things. We need to investigate deeply and understand why and how the data was gathered. What is it and how close does that data fit to what you need it to be, what you need it to use it for, what you need it to do with it? And actually looking at those differences between what you need and what you've got, and then maintaining and developing our statistical skills to see, is it good enough to use? It might be an absolutely brilliant data set, but if it isn't actually what you need to use it for, having the courage to say, no, I've done the stats and actually this isn't what I need, it doesn't look like the data I was expecting, can take quite a lot of strength. Is it only applicable to part of your study? And if you are going to combine the data sets, then how? So we really, when we're talking about these challenges, it's the ability to ask the questions and its ability to maintain our stats skills that we can answer those questions before we actually go away and use the secondary data set. Now, when I was asked to talk in this stream and I looked at the title of the stream, it occurred to me that it would be exceptionally remiss of me when we're going to eyeball each other and look each other in the eye, to acknowledge not only where our secondary data sources come from, but also to remember that really at fundamental level, the ethical issues in using primary data sets are no different to the ethical issues in using secondary data sets. What needs an awful lot of detailed consideration, particularly when we're using secondary data set, is consent and identifying data. I've talked a lot about time, and I think time is one thing that we all desperately try to find more of. But you need to look at the data and understand firstly if there's anything identifying in that data set. And if there is, well, then it comes back to a primary ethical issue. If there isn't, but you're combining it now with data sets that means somebody could be identified, well, how are you going to maintain privacy and confidentiality? All of these issues need to be considered in a great deal of depth before we start to use secondary data sets. They are not something that can be glossed over, and it has to be a fundamental part of how we decide to use secondary data sets. But my focus is on bias within data sets today. And I was trying to think about how we can, as a community, start to talk about bias within secondary data sets, how we can come up with a language that helps us all understand bias within data sets and actually find it, because we all work in such different areas, we all work on such different data sets. And my approach, rightly or wrongly, is basically to think of secondary data sets as going through the hiring process for when we want to hire somebody into a company. Okay, I've got some lovely, lovely employees who are fantastic. And when we think of secondary data sets, my approach is this. We need to see if it's okay to use. That's basically an interview. And then if we think it's okay, we might make a job offer. And then we check the data, which is the induction process, and we do all of that before we actually start to do any work. Now, this is where we can start to put our unconscious bias training to really good use. Now, many of us work in companies where unconscious bias training is mandatory. Brilliant. If you've not done any, I highly recommend you go online and find yourself a good course, because the skills you learn when you're talking about unconscious bias training at work can really be put to good use when we're talking about secondary data sources. So we have effectively a job interview for our data set. How are we going to start looking for if it's biased? And the first thing to acknowledge is that there is bias that lurks within data sets and the results we produce. So we need to increase our contact with the data of what or who the data is representing. Do you know enough about the populations that you are working with to be able to spot if there is bias within the data set? Learn about the groups, learn about the populations. What is the general use case for the data? And where are the outliers? Or where could the outliers be? Now, outliers is a really interesting question, because in terms of statistics, we can maybe sometimes define that. But if we're not talking about necessarily about numbers, what do outliers look like? And when we find them in our data sets, what do they tell us? Were you expecting that to be an actual outlier? And are there any steps that we can take to actually address the situation? If we are proactive in recognizing the differences in the data set, and like I said, working with secondary data sets can be challenging, but it's also an opportunity for us to learn more skills. So it sounds really obvious, but if you're not working with a diverse set of analysts, how are you going to be able to spot if there isn't a diversity within the data set that you're working with? It takes lots of different viewpoints to be able to look at the data set and understand if there is bias within there. I talked earlier about having a way of understanding if the data set is good enough for you to use, if it's what you actually need. Well, in order to do that, you're going to need a clearly defined measurable criteria against which you're evaluating the data. And how do you know if it's acceptable? Set that gold standard for your team, for your department, for you, wherever. Maybe write that up and then measure your data sets against that. But I think what's really important is that you action these and get feedback. Try and prove yourself wrong. I don't think we always do that enough, especially when we're all under time pressure. Are you managing to prove yourself wrong? Are all your assumptions just right? Because in that situation, you might not be looking wide enough. There's many, many ways that bias can end up in data sets, and we can talk about sample bias and measurement bias, but that's what's caused it. What we need to do is move the conversation on to what it is. Now, we need to explain what it looks like. And I always think the good starting point is that bias is essentially a deviation. And as statisticians, we have an incredibly rich language of ability to express a difference, a variation away from the overall population? Why does what we are working with not look like the overall population? I think as a community, and certainly the people I work with, we need to get better at explaining this and explaining it in a way that people can understand. Because it turns out that not everybody appears to love statistics as much as those of us at this conference do. So once we've had the job interview for the data and we think it's passed and we've done our best to actually find the bias in this data, before we really put the data to work, we've kind of got to do an induction process. And I think this is where we all have an incredible role to play, particularly if we have to label our data. Even though this is online, I know as soon as I start mentioning data labels, I can see the eye rolls, hear the groans, and some maybe muting and walkings away. I would absolutely advocate, particularly now as we are all working apart, that you document absolutely everything. It's one of the things, my company's always been remote. We've never actually had an office. The lovely people who work for me are spread across the UK, and we literally document everything, absolutely everything. So when we start talking about labelling, again, set yourself that gold standard of what is it that is going to be acceptable for use to help you understand if this data set isn't representative, to help you understand if this data doesn't look like the population it is meant to be representative, if it's not got the general case studies in there, if the outliers aren't what you're necessarily expecting. Take your time, because right now it has never ever been easier, in all honesty, to pull data sets together, press a button and get a result. Now, again, I can hear people going, well, you might think it's easy, but you should look where I work. I'm going to hark you back to the days when I was at university, when we were up very early to get your precious half an hour on a cray at the boot up time on a Saturday morning. It really is actually easier than it has ever been to pull data sets together, but it has never ever been more crucial that we spend the time to look at the data sets we're working with, to understand when they are not looking like the population, and how we do that and the tools we use are becoming increasingly important. It's not a quick solution. There isn't necessarily a quick win. But if you invest in the labelling, if you invest in understanding the difference and the deviations of your samples from the population, it will actually be worth it. Now, one of the things we also need to take context in is that if we are actually going to have the induction process and we now think the data is great and we're actually going to put it to work, what we are going to now talk about is the uncertainty and the language that we start to use, because uncertainty is absolutely everywhere and we cannot shy away from it. I have always been of the opinion that it is better to be absolutely upfront about the uncertainty in our analysis, because at the end of the day, it really boils down to trust. You want your results to be trusted, and equally, when you see results, you want to be able to trust them. Talking about uncertainty doesn't make our results look weak. In anything, it makes them stronger. It makes us admit and be open about what we're doing. I think the question should be not, do we talk about uncertainty, but how do we start to talk about uncertainty with everybody that we work with, to spark a debate so that more people understand what uncertainty is. We can present uncertainty in a variety of different ways. We can talk about tables or ranges. We can give numbers of ranges. We can give graphs, but that's really only part of the answer. Numbers have enormous emotion attached to them. Numbers viscerally move people as much as any art form will ever move them. And there seems to be a pervasiveness that the answer is always a number, and people click onto that number. What we really need to do is start to move that conversation towards how do the people we work with and the people we want to communicate with take in the information, and how can we get them to start to talk about the difference, the deviations, the variations that are likely to be seen in the answers? Because if we get the conversation moving on to that, we can start to talk much more freely about potential biases within data sets and how they can be fixed and what we need to do that. And then in the results, how can these variations that we're seeing actually answer some of the biggest questions that society has, some of the biggest questions, the trickiest problems that we're working on, to actually move society and business forwards. Now, I'm going to grant that this is going to take time, and admittedly, it might require some of us to either rekindle or get a love of writing and working on our communication skills. I certainly did A-level maths, physics and chemistry because I was absolutely adamant I was never going to write anything ever again. And my PhD supervisor used to pull his hair out about my complete lack of English grammar. I have had to work really hard to learn to communicate in a way that people understand what I'm talking about. And I certainly don't get it right all the time. And I certainly have to go back and try different ways. But if we're going to really move this on and start to tackle the issues of bias within data and bias in our results, then we have to find a way to engage with our audiences, that we have to find a way of how we are communicating engages them. But it's not just writing, it's taking the time to have conversations. And I know time is the thread that has run through my whole presentation. No quick solution. The ability to have conversations at the moment when lots of people are zoomed out is actually getting harder, I would say, almost to the point of pre-working away from the office. But we need to keep those conversations going. What we want at the end of this is a defensible set of analysis of results that people will understand. That is not easy. But if we get our communications right, and we invest the time in our skills, and we invest the time in our critical questioning, we will start to find the bias expressed in a way that we can all get to grips with and actually start to answer some of those bigger challenges that we have when we're working in statistics at the moment. I'd like to thank you all for listening. I promised that I'd finish on time or a little bit early to answer any questions that there might be.
Thanks, Sophie. That was great. So one question, just very, very quickly, is can you give an example of a data set that you've, an example of a time that you've had a data set that you were really hoping you'd be able to use, but then on investigation, you realized that it was biased, and how did you do that?
So it's how I met you. We're talking about the fish and the chemicals in the fish ears. So I've been doing research on looking into the chemical composition of shellfish, and we were really hoping for an extra data set that was going to be able to be used. But when it came, as odd as this sounds, it wasn't actually shellfish. So yes, they were marine. It was to do with fish, as in fish that swim in the sea, not shellfish. And there are very, very different metabolic processes about how those chemicals are stored. So we had waited a long time and had very, very high hopes. But when we actually boiled down to what the results were looking, even though they were from the same areas, we just couldn't use them because they had such different profiles. But we had to sit down and actually get the chemometrics. And this was how we met. We were talking about inductively coupled mass spectrometers, and I got very excited about error bounds and inductively coupled mass spectrometers. But yeah, we literally drew the distributions. That was how we found the differences. And it meant that we had to do two separate sets of analysis.
Oh, gosh. So there's a question about the Women in Data Science and Statistics, SIG. I can answer that one quickly. That's not actually for you, Sophie. It's a special interest group, or SIG stands for Special Interest Group of the Royal Statistical Society, and you'll find it listed on the RSS website under Special Interest Groups. So please do promote that. Your organization, group, club, team, association, etc. Excellent. All right, Sophie, thank you so much for your time. I am really thrilled to have as our second speaker, Raluca Crisan. She's the Director of Data Science at Merkle, Aquila. And her experience in data science has made her an expert in algorithmic bias and AI. And that has inspired her, together with partners, to co-found a startup called Etiq, which is specifically working on developing solutions to the algorithmic bias problem. So, Raluca, thank you so much for coming to speak to us, and please get started.
Great, thank you so much for the invite, and also, yeah, I'm very happy to be speaking here, and hopefully you'll find this interesting. So I'm here primarily as a builder of solutions. So rather than a researcher or, to some extent, an expert, this is about the experience of trying to build these things to help people, and we're still trying. But essentially, I think our goal is to build a scalable solution to the algorithmic bias problem. First I will get a little bit into the mission why we're trying to achieve this, and then I'll give a little bit of an overview of this journey and where we're hoping to take it, where we got to and where we're hoping to take it. Obviously, the audience for this talk is very rarefied, so I'm expecting that everyone is kind of very mindful and very concerned with this algorithmic bias problem, but this is what keeps us going. So I do want to just quickly touch on it. So I think in the past few months, in this kind of first half of the year, we saw a lot more media exposure on system inequality, and I think we were reminding once again that it is as present as ever. I think while some things became quite visible, other things are still not as visible, and we find, in fields like justice, recruitment, financial services, we find people's lives being impacted by automated decisions on a daily basis. However, we know that the algorithms that drive these automated decisions can often be biased against certain demographic groups. Partly this is the case because the data that feeds the algorithms is a reflection of society's biases. But for whatever the reason, the outcome is dire. For instance, if you're a woman, you can get a lower credit card limit than your husband. This has happened. If you're, we all know the ProPublica story about if you're an African American, your predicted risk of reoffending is much higher than if you're a white American, even if in the past you committed much fewer crimes and less serious. So this is all very concerning about use of machine learning to kind of impact people's lives in this way. But at Etiq, we believe that if machine learning is used correctly, it actually can provide a fairer process, and it can push this agenda of equal opportunity forward. And we think that part of the reasons people started using these algorithms were that they were a little bit more objective than the humans, but they do need to be properly properly accounted for, and this bias problem needs to be sorted. So for us as kind of builders in the space, this is a incredibly rich field, which is great. We see there's more and more frameworks, and there's active areas of research which propel the field, and ultimately I think that these pursuits will be felt in practice. But for me personally, the action I kind of wanted to take was a little bit more to bridge this this world of frameworks and research and this world of practitioners and industry, so that what we are able to have a direct impact on people's lives. That's ultimately the goal, and direct positive impact. So this is kind of the format we set up on the solution. And once we came up with this format of a software solution in the space, which is a little bit unusual, you see a lot of consultancies, we also had a few other criteria to go with it. This is not just about solving the problem, but it's also about the potential users liking it and it being repeatable. More so than any software product, this one, we intended to build it as a team product as well. This is not just about the data scientist kind of wrestling with a problem on his or her own, but it's about people, whether in business or compliance or even regulators, taking note of what's going on and chipping in and kind of together coming up with the right approach. So, keeping, with this kind of criteria in mind, let's say, we kind of went on our journey. And from the very beginning, a theme that ran through everything really is this tension between monitoring for bias and mitigating it. So it's a little bit like a pendulum, it sort of back and forth, back and forth. And when we first started, and even now, you have a wealth of tools that really focus on the monitoring aspect. And you have, compliance is understandably very embedded in the topic. A sector analogy that people use is that of cybersecurity. Bias is represented as this external threat, something people need to watch out for and catch real time, insure against, and so forth. And especially for tools that address the problem in production, that's a valid approach. And the issue for us was that, while no doubt there's a lot of value in monitoring, we weren't too sure we were monitoring something that was bias-free to begin with, whatever that meant, and it just felt just because the model reached that status and it was now, being used, it didn't mean it was actually good. So while our initial version for this product was around monitoring, we kind of quickly discarded it. What we kept from it was the idea that there's a metric to monitor and audit for. So again, this is a very interesting, peculiar field, like maybe all kind of research fields, but if you look at it, there's so many metrics and definitions because fairness is really very hard to pin down. But when we looked around, we chose a metric that seemed appropriate, partly because our users, partly because of the academics. It's equal opportunity, it also has a great name. The reason why this metric doesn't make people as uncomfortable as other metrics is because it doesn't kind of assume an ideal distribution, doesn't assume that you should have equal proportion of men and women kind of, accepted by an algorithm for a job. So, for better or worse, people are kind of more warming up to it a little bit more easily. And all it really says, a very straightforward metric, all really says that the model should really behave in a, just as well for one demographic group as it does for another, which is something, our users can get super comfortable with fairly quickly. So, as we moved away from this kind of monitoring idea into mitigation, we took this metric, we focused on it, and we're thinking, okay, we're just going to optimize for it, right? That's a straightforward machine learning program. It's not straightforward, but it's a straightforward machine learning setup. And moving away from monitoring, which focused very highly on kind of production end of the pipeline, we went at the kind of the opposite, the very beginning of a pipeline, project pipeline. So, we follow the field, which is broadly separated into pre, in, and post processing, and we stuck on pre-processing. And it's very similar to, I guess, the previous speakers kind of thinking, but the once we had, this metric we're optimizing for, which is actually both equal opportunity and accuracy and kind of minimizing trade-off, once we had this part of the pipeline, which is around the pre-processing and kind of trying to impact the data, the feature data as little as possible while still optimizing for these metrics, we had a much more compact problem to solve. So as a result, we could kind of have some solution going. And, we did relatively well to solve it. We obtained good results, but something stuck with us a little bit. And I think it's a reflection of the fact that ultimately the metric itself is an indicator of a problem, but it's not really the be-all, end-all, of anything really when it comes to bias. So what transpired, our solution kind of itself pushed us through this idea that we really need to get our users engaged with a very investigative approach to looking at that data in terms of them starting to look at potential hypotheses related to discrimination and so forth. So for instance, if there's a particular group that's faring particularly poorly, over a certain time period, that maybe something to do with data collection at that time that's really messing things about. It could, or is it something to do with the product, maybe more broadly that they're selling? Is there something in here and there that is, reflecting some kind of existing society bias. So that was something we took from our kind of solution, and we really did want to explore it further to get these users really feeling for the subjects of their models. Roughly around the same time, because we had some sort of solution that we could talk about, we started talking a little bit more widely with both kind of the community as large, but also potential users. And around this time, this is a slight detour, one of our potential users who eventually became an advisor, he was very persuasive in his point, which is the user need is not only about identifying and mitigating bias. I mean, great if you do it, good job. But it is, from a regulatory point of view and compliance point of view, it is a lot about showing that you've done it and show it, that kind of ensuring against bias happening. And, being reassuring, safeguarding, whatever you want to call it. And, so far we had managed to kind of keep in our lane relatively well. So by at that point, so we were kind of focused on algorithmic bias. We had like, a bit of a niche and so forth. But with this user need, which was very much a important need and, fundamentally not a nice to have for a product, we realized that we really had to tackle and look into fields like explainability and MLOps, which they're very rich, it's not out of laziness that we didn't consider it, but they are very rich fields, a lot of research, a lot of products in them. And the big, you can't really solve all problems, right? So we just want to solve our little problems. But we had to. I mean, there's no real way to get away from that if you want to build a solution to the problem, because this transparency component really had to come through. So just as a short recap, so at this stage we did relatively well in coming up with the compact problem. We designed somewhat of a well-performing solution for it, which we're still developing. But then we really needed, and we felt we really needed to have this investigative insights approach to the solution, and also we needed some form of explainability. At this point, we also had increasing conversations with the AI ethics community, and I think the people in that community are very good at expressing very deep philosophical notions and showing how they apply to these kind of situations, data science and so forth. And one of the kind of principles, if you will, we got from it is that some of the things we're really very used to doing in data science are potentially problematic when it comes to the point, when we start talking about bias. So for instance, the importance of a feature, or, that's a really big deal. Income being more important than to predicting, outcome than playing bingo and so forth. And all the stats packages, all the amount of, tools, they all have it, and it's important. And it's certainly relevant, don't get me wrong, but kind of a byproduct of how we set up the process and how we talk about feature is that it gives the appearance of fairness, especially when it divorces the decision from the human impact. So the way we talk about it a little bit legitimizes the decision, even though more often than not, there is a potentially high degree of uncertainty involved with it. The uncertainty is not a bad thing. It's kind of cushioning that uncertainty with language. So for instance, income drives likelihood of repayment has very different emotional connotation to we can't give that person a loan because he makes less than 20K a year, right? So both sentences are saying very similar things, but the way that they talk about it can be very different impressions. And a lot of traditional modeling techniques rely very heavily on this idea of feature, variable importance, and have a very direct way of translating this into outcome. Especially in the highly regulated sectors that we're looking at. With newer techniques, for instance, it's much harder to tell because the decisioning is a little bit more complex, and it has more features, and no one can tell. But in a sense, we find that that's a good thing, because the reason why some of these techniques outperform the more traditional ones is because probably reality is more complex than this kind of reduction to principle we're trying to get these features to do for us. So what emerged from us from this point, and this may be a slight digression, but it's more like a principle of design, that it's about trying to focus on putting the human at the center of designing these automated decision systems. And in the hope that if we start referring to the subjects more directly, then the builders will be kind of more driven to think of potential discrimination, that is, potentially being experienced by these subjects. So this is kind of almost at the end of my talk. Obviously, there's no, we're still building this, we have a solution. We've added much more things still since we kind of, I wrote this talk. But what I want to impress on is that while this is a very tricky and confusing field, we are still very motivated in our mission, and we believe that even an incremental change in how people think about it and what people do would be, could create so much potential benefit, like downstream to actual human people. So one thing to kind of leave you with slightly more optimistic is that numbers do have a lot of impact. For instance, hearing someone say, 0 numbers of females picked by an algorithm for a job is a very strong statement. There's many other examples like that. There's an intuition that we have that number and others like it are wrong. And when we are presented with it, we take notice and we go ahead and we try to change the world so that number is no longer applicable. And we think that similarly, like machine learning, it can reflect to us these issues, these biases, and hopefully if it's reflecting correctly and we get it, then we can go ahead and kind of change the world and make this inequality, at least diminish it, if not completely reduce it. So yeah, thank you very much for this, and hopefully I wasn't too much over the time. Eugenie.
Thank you, Raluca. No, that was perfect. Actually, we've got a couple of minutes for questions. So could you please explain again the metric that you're talking about, this equality of opportunity metric? In particular, I'm thinking about the example that I read somewhere, and it's probably somebody's paper or book that I'm quoting without reference, and I apologize for that. But there was some algorithm that was selecting people for jobs, and in order to remove the bias by gender and ethnicity, they had ensured that that no gender or ethnicity information was fed into the system. Nevertheless, the system selected white men, and when they investigated the 2 features that were most likely to predict selections, it was being named Jared and playing lacrosse, right? Which were both things that tended to select upper middle class white men. So when you talk about a system that is designed to treat different groups fairly, we know that just leaving those variables out doesn't accomplish that. How does that metric solve that problem of correlated variables that are fed in, influencing the outcome?
Yeah, so equal opportunity is just true positive rates being equal for the different groups. So what that means that first of all, you measure this, right? So it's just an indicator, but you measure it. So, we know blind, leaving the variables out, it makes some difference, but you have so many other proxies that it's like you'd have to get rid of all your variables as well to get rid of proxies. But putting that aside, how does it helps? Because for instance, if you have very big discrepancy and your model is great for men and like really bad for women, maybe worse, not worse than random, but maybe there's like more than 20% difference like in accuracy for the 2 groups, then you start to wonder why. Like you're obviously using certain feature, depending what your technique is, but you're obviously using certain features in certain way, and they work well at predicting for men, but you probably are not really getting some factors for women that you should be getting. That's like a short explanation, but there's other metrics as well that are, from the same family, if you will.
Yeah. Have people looked, okay, this is just me, like, thinking about things. Have people tried using, effectively things like orthogonal variables, right? Where you take your space of variables and you take only those rotated elements that are orthogonal, in fact, to your demographic variables for which you're trying to control. Has there been any work along that line?
Yeah, so there's a few pre-processing techniques that do maybe slightly more kind of, not fancy, but slightly more complex versions of that. And yeah, I mean, I see I'm doing, we're doing pre-processing. There's a lot of value in pre-processing techniques. I mean, maybe my talk sounds a bit negative, but it's more that these kind of things, they're not the be-all end-all, but they're incredibly useful to helping. The problem is that you have things like treatment issues, right? So you have features that are wrong in themselves, like the actual, right? Because bias and so forth. You have, wrong labels a lot of times as well. So, there's deeper problems, but by all means, like some of the pre-processing techniques are really effective. And, something like 40% reduction for like an algorithm just by introducing this technique, that's like pretty good, with no kind of difference in accuracy. That's, why not do it? I mean, it's better than nothing kind of thing. Yeah, for sure.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Raluca. It sounds really exciting, and I hope that in the future you're going to be telling us again more about the fabulous successes that you're having with Etiq and your collaborators there. So thanks very much for talking to us. I'm delighted as our third speaker today to have Roger Halliday. Roger is the Chief Statistician and Data Officer for the Scottish Government. And in that role, he is responsible for the quality and trustworthiness of the data that's used to support government decisions. And therefore, in particular, there's a real drive to reduce inequalities and improve well-being. And therefore, these questions of ethics and bias in the data that's used for making decisions is particularly important. So I'm delighted to have him here today to tell us about how he tackles those problems and how he collects, publishes, and uses data. Thanks, Roger.
Brilliant. Well, thanks very much for the introduction, Eugenie. Like I was saying, a key component of avoiding bias in data science is just getting the data right in the first place. And so, I've been looking at the specific issues around that more broadly in government, but, I wanted to talk today about how I've been trying to do that in the context of sex and gender. And that's, in my role as the Chief Statistician for Scotland, and in my role is as the Chief Data Officer, and also of leading and currently the interim Chief Executive of an organisation called Research Data Scotland, which aims to improve access to the data that we have about people, places and businesses in Scotland. So I'm just going to say something about kind of how we use data in Scotland to improve well-being, the aims and context for the work on sex and gender, how I went about this and some of the principles I was using, because that's quite important here, and then what I found, what I heard, and what that all means in terms of an emerging position on this. So the context here is, for us, I suspect that many people listening today will have seen the picture on the right-hand side of this slide, which is around the UN Sustainable Development Goals. In Scotland, we've got a national performance framework which encapsulates how we want to achieve those UN and contribute to those UN goals. And really, it's something that's agreed not just in government, but across the public sector in Scotland. We've got CBI on board and the voluntary sector. It was launched more than 10 years ago now and relaunched a couple of years ago. And one of the focuses is about creating a country, and the overall purpose is about creating a country where there's opportunities for all of Scotland to flourish through increased well-being, sustainable and inclusive economic growth. And so, I'm in charge of kind of measuring progress on this indicators, and of which we do through 81 outcome measures. Most of them are about people, so we can consider whether there are aspects of their well-being from looking at their different socio-demographic backgrounds. And all of this requires high-quality statistics to be collected, published, and used to improve decisions. And really, that's my goal. And more broadly, the vision's to systematically use data. So we've got lots of examples where that insight into people, places, and businesses can improve well-being. We've got lots of kind of data science capability in government and across Scotland more broadly. But often our data is not organised in ways that make it easy. It takes too long to access and to link data, and therefore data innovation, data science can't happen more systematically. That's why we're setting up the new organisation I mentioned earlier on, Research Data Scotland. And one of the principles of Research Data Scotland, this data is only going to be brought together and able to be accessed if it's going to be about improving the public good and to better understand issues around equalities for people in Scotland. So that's where we are with the vision. But then going on to the sex and gender, the topic is very much disputed. The Scottish Government consulted on reforms to the Gender Recognition Act that was introduced more than 15 years ago. They looked at reforms and did a consultation on it a couple of years ago, and it received more than 15,000 responses, with the majority of them showing support for that reform. But since that consultation a couple of years ago, the debate on gender recognition has become quite polarised, both in Scotland and elsewhere, and say that generally when I've been involved in things, there's a respectful, vigorous debate, but quite respectful debate. However, that's not necessarily what we've seen around sex and gender, with strong opinions on different sides of this. And the Scottish Government were planning to go out again on the reforms, further consultation, and did so at the end of last year. But last summer I was asked to consider the issue of sex and gender in data. So how data is collected, i.e. the questions that we ask and how we go about collecting it, how data is presented, and then how data is used. And so the overall aim that I've got, linking back to that national performance framework, is to make a contribution to a country with opportunities for all to flourish. And well, how are we going to do that? Well, I think the kind of next level down from that is really help better decision making across Scotland by improving people's understanding of the similarities and differences of people due to sex and gender, and more broadly around other socio-demographic characteristics. And then how we're going to do that is by helping organisations think through how they collect and how they use and publish data, and to do that both by providing some clarity around the ask that's made of people that are doing data collection and support for them in the form of training and in the form of guidance. Now, because this was a relatively contested area, is the polite way of putting it, kind of how I went about this work is always going to be important. I'm going to be challenged on how this work's done. So my starting point was a set of statistical principles. And luckily for us working in government and working in official statistics, more broadly, we've got a published set of principles. It's a code of practice for official statistics that was updated a couple of years ago, and we've got an equivalent European code. So, what I did is picked out a few principles that I felt were important here, and that I've kind of listed here In fact, there are a couple that weren't listed that I kind of felt were quite important. So making sure that data collection is carried out in a way that maintains the dignity and respect of people that were being asked questions. And then also, if we get the data, then let's have a look at it. And if it's showing something odd, then we need to investigate, get to the bottom and understand why that's the case, and then try and do something about it. Is it a statistical factor or a data-related factor, or is there something going on that we need to address? So a set of statistical principles was quite important. And then on top of that, how we went about this was absolutely vital, is absolutely vital because it's still underway. So I always try and take an open approach to the way that I work, and I think that this has got to be it's got to be the way that we work in the sort of data and statistics world, and I've kind of felt that it was more important to do that than ever in this work, given the concerns. I feel that kind of fosters trust. While it opens challenge at each stage, it's better to open that and deal with it as you go, rather than to feel that people aren't involved and that people are the challenge comes in when it's kind of too late to do anything about it. Then what I did is I brought together a set of experts. So experts in data collection from around Scotland, so local government, the NHS, police, census, prisons and more, and then also experts on equalities from government and from kind of a national organisation called the Equality and Human Rights Commission. I wanted this to be a transparent group, so we publish all our papers, we publish all our agendas, and then it was important that that wasn't the only voice that was heard. So I spoke to around 15 different interest groups who had different perspectives on the sex and gender in data issue, and sex and gender issues more broadly. And then I ran 2 public events, so I heard from about 50 people, again representing a range of views, some of which from represented organisations or particular groups, some just have got their own personal experience of these issues or their own opinions. And then I've put out a monthly blog, sort of advertised through social media, and that's just to kind of open and lay out what the thinking was, who I'd spoken to, and it's important as I did that to respond to comments, and there was quite a lot of them, particularly where they were cynical or suspicious of what we were doing. It genuinely, I think, helped people turn the rhetoric about being open into reality. So definitely that's one of my lessons from this and from other work. The more open you can be earlier on, as I'm sure it pays off. And then in terms of the findings from this, so what I did was an initial analysis of how things are done here in Scotland. I'm sure what happens in Scotland's no different from other places, and in fact didn't really find anywhere around the world that had properly nailed how to collect data on sex and gender properly. And the issues that are flagged here are ones that I think are picked up from other places as well. So yeah, really, there weren't any standard questions looking around the world used for collecting this type of information, which is unusual, I would say. So some organisations offered people a binary choice, kind of male, female, man, woman. Some organisations offered an other category. Some are voluntary questions, and some don't offer voluntary questions. Some ask for gender identity, some for sex, and more often than not, organisations use those terms quite interchangeably. In fact, when I spoke to organisations, I guess part of the reason for that is that many organisations view those terms and the language quite differently, but there is some kind of consensus. So often organisations define sex generally as whether you're male or female. While there are different aspects to someone's sex, there's sort of biology of that. That generally that's how most organisations look at that. But there's also kind of legal sex, and so for a trans person with a gender recognition certificate, legal sex is their acquired sex. But for a trans person without one of those certificates, gender recognition certificate, or for other people, legal sex is the sex registered at birth. And then for gender, obviously that's in fact the RSS put out a paper on this and defined gender as a social construction relating to behaviours and attributes based on labels of masculinity or femininity, and so it's something personal or an internal perception of oneself. So it's they're kind of innate sense of themselves as a man, woman, or having no gender. And then transgender is someone whose gender identity differs from their sex at birth. Not that anyone's really collecting data about the trans population. So, and all of this means that some organisations are unclear how to do this well. Some people are nervous about getting it wrong, and so don't collect data at all, or they publish data about sex or gender. Well, they don't collect it, or they don't publish it. I guess is what I found. And then when I spoke to the various, I had some brilliant conversations with people, and while they often had strong and quite opposing views at times about some of this, there was much they agreed on. So really, everybody said, look, if you're collecting data, you need to be clear why you're collecting it. Let's start with the need for collecting data. Let's be clear about exactly what data we're collecting, whether we're collecting data on gender, whether we're collecting data on sex, and have definitions for those things and guidance for those things that make it clear. And then ultimately, everyone agreed, look, we need better published data about all of this stuff, and we need to start using it in public policy and more widely. And that in doing so, you've got to ask questions that are sensitive, that are respectful for people. They might have different views, the groups, on what those things contain, the construction of that. But yeah, very, very strong sense that we need to do more in the space. And while we do, we need to, and that includes publication, we need to be mindful of people's privacy in how we do that. So in terms of where we are now, I've kind of done analysis of this, got the expert view, I've got stakeholder views, kind of brought together an emerging position, which is ultimately starts from a sort of declaration that organisations in Scotland should publish data about socio-demographic characteristics of people that they serve, and that goes beyond just public bodies. But I think that's a good place for me to start, because I have some influence with those groups, and that has to start with why we need the data in the first place. What are people going to do with it? What decisions they're going to make? And that could be things like equality monitoring, the better design of services that promote equality in diversity. It might be about making a decision about a specific individual, whether that's a decision to advise they get a service which is just appropriate for somebody from a single sex, or it might be to understand the effect of a particular policy or treatment as well. And then once you're clear about that, it's important to consider how to collect information well and in an unbiased way. And I think that, for me, starting about the questions on sex or gender or trans status, and using standard questions, and developed some standard questions that currently testing, and that. But it's not just about those questions. It's also thinking about the way that you set up the survey, or the way that you collect administrative data in ways that mean that you're not going to get biased data for other questions that you're asking. And again, that means really testing questions before they go into the field. And that links to maximizing response. And so I think that means testing questions, and also means asking things in a respectful way, allowing people to say what they prefer not to say, if that's the case. And then sort of going on from questions to then what do you do about it? The first thing to say is that being transparent and open about what you've done, what you've chosen, why you've chosen particular sort of questions is going to be quite important. And then thinking about how it will be analysed and published. And I think the thing that came across to me there is that this isn't, while I was looking at sex and gender, in terms of publication, this isn't just about publishing data about men and women, male, female groups separately, or the trans population. This is about kind of the interplay of sex and gender and other socio-demographic characteristics in order to really understand the populations that you're serving. And that, again, needs to be done in a way public trust, and that comes from maintaining privacy of the people whose data you're working with. So in terms of sort of outputs from this, the first one that I'm looking at is a sort of checklist. Well, this is an emerging checklist for organisations. Just as it's taking people through that process of how they're thinking about how to collect data on sex and gender, on trans status, what questions they ask, how they set up that data collection, how they avoid bias in doing that, and then once they have the data, what does that actually tell them? Not just about men, women, male, female, but about the populations that they serve, and how do they publish that in order to, and in fact, share the underlying data in order to maximise its value whilst maintaining people's privacy. So what I'm expecting to do with this, because this is work in progress, I'd kind of hope to have this all done by now. COVID's come in the way of that to some extent, but I'm expecting to take that emerging position in the emerging checklist forward. So, like I say, we've got an open process. So over the coming weeks, I'm expecting to publish some draft guidance and to seek views from all the people I've engaged with as part of that process. I'm expecting I'm expecting a lot of challenge from that process, which I'm absolutely convinced will be useful. I've got this testing of some standard questions to go and make sure that they work well in the field. And so I'll sort of consider all of that feedback that I get and aim to publish some new guidance before the end of 2020 on that looks at some of the material that I've presented here. And that state my expectations, or in fact, but what will accompany the guidance will be a letter to all public bodies in Scotland, and stating the expectations, the findings, the guidance, and also offering some training for organisations who collect data, because I've got a clear sense that actually collecting data from people isn't necessarily straightforward. when they're asking quite personal questions that this subject contains. And then all of that, I think, will contribute to a wider approach to improving data on equalities in Scotland. Yeah, this was announced by our government up here last week. And ultimately, going back to the National Performance Framework and the UN Sustainable Development Goals, I'm hoping and expecting this to improve the completeness, the publication, the use of data on sex, gender, and trans people, and in doing that can lead to an understanding of these issues that in turn lead to policies that promote equality and diversity and improve well-being in Scotland. And if I achieve that, then I'll be very, very pleased. So thank you for listening today. Very happy to open it up now to any questions that you might have for me this afternoon.
Thanks, Roger. That was really fantastic. So there are a couple of questions that have come through. One is, are you willing to reveal for us what you propose as the gender/sex question that, what is the way to phrase this? I mean, we've all seen so many different ways in surveys or in things we've been asked to fill in, where we're given 7 different alternatives or something. Have you come to any clarity on what seems to perform best in terms of getting usable, useful, and honest data?
So I'm going to sort of hold back a little bit on that, because I'm going to publish the guidance on sort of draft guidance next month, and part of that reason is that we're doing a bit of testing on that. We're checking with our lawyers on that. But I would say that in general, that there are particular reasons why you might want to collect data on a sex basis. They're not all that many, and that so I think that collecting data in this space, I would say keep it simple, and there are some simple questions out there, such as what is your sex or what is your gender. Being respectful and offering people a prefer not to say option is going to be quite important. Offering people the ability to describe their gender is going to be important.
For instance, with a separate describe box that would then need to be qualitatively coded independently.
Yeah, I think that's right, and exactly how the questions asked might differ just slightly based upon whether it's a face-to-face interview, whether it's an online survey, whether it's some administrative data and there's somebody filling in data, or you get a paper form or whatever. There's a few different modes of this. So again, we're sort of looking at testing that at the moment.
Okay, and the second question that came up was, how do you ensure representation of trans individuals when there is still a stigma that might make them reluctant to be honest about their answer? And in particular, this is my spin on that, is that there are known methods for collecting population level estimates of things which people are reluctant to be honest about. For instance, roll a die. If the die is a 1 or a 2, you put down masculine. If it's 5 or 6, you put down feminine, and if it's 3 or 4, then you answer honestly, right? Which allows no particular individual's answer to be, to label them, but nevertheless can give you more honest information at the national level about the representation of these groups. Is there anything along, various methods for trying to get a better and honest estimate of these populations?
So I would start by saying that the start of this is, what do you need the data for in the first place? If it's to make a decision about an individual, then those the kind of things that you described.
Right. You can't do that, obviously.
Quite tricky. But I would say that being so I think there's a couple of things. One is that allowing people to describe themselves and not being avoiding any situations where questions are mandatory. The third thing is make sure that interviewers are properly trained in how to and people collecting data are properly trained in collecting that data. And then I think there's something also in being clear, well, why are you collecting it in the first place?
Mm-hmm.
And being open about that process, like I say, fosters trust. Depending on the organization doing that, I guess if the organization itself is not trusted, then that falls away somewhat. But I think those are some of the things that I point to.
Mm-hmm. I have another question here, and I hope that I'm interpreting it correctly. Are you also going to be issuing guidance on other aspects of demographic data collection beyond sex and gender?
So not as part of this particular bit of work, but we've made a commitment in government in Scotland to develop a comprehensive approach to improving data collection and analysis around equalities and human rights. And so we will be doing that. And I should say that while I'm talking about what we're doing in Scotland, we're very much working with colleagues across different parts of the UK on this. We have people from the Office for National Statistics on our expert working group, and I've spoken to people in Wales and Northern Ireland about this work, and I certainly know that there's quite a bit of work going on across the UK. So it's not just in Scotland where we've got shared ambitions.
Fantastic. I think we're out of time, unfortunately. I have like 5 or 6 more questions, but I don't think I'm going to have time to ask them. But Roger, thank you so much for sharing about the work that's being done in Scotland. And again, Raluca and Sophie, thank you to you two as well. This has been a really informative session, and thank you so much, all 3 of you, for participating.